Cool. Okay. Hello, my name is Michelle Furmansky, and I am a features journalist at JURIST Legal News and Commentary. Today, I am with film critic Tanul Thakur. Tanul Thakur is an award-winning film critic and journalist. He won the National Film Award for Best Film Critic and the Mumbai Press Club Award for Best Lifestyle and Entertainment Story in 2015. A film critic for The Wire, he has written features, reviews, and essays for, among notable others, The Caravan, Mint Lounge, Seminar, GQ, Yahoo India, and OZY. He has been interviewed by leading newspapers, portals, and channels across the world, including The Economist, The Times, The Financial Times, The Hindu, CNN, BBC, and News Laundry for his views on cinema, writing, and culture. Today, we will be discussing the state of film censorship in India and what the abolition of the Film Certification Appellate Tribunal, or the FCAT, means for filmmakers and future films. In India, the Central Board of Film Certification, or the CBFC, rates and censors films before their official release. In the past, filmmakers and producers could appeal to the FCAT, or once again, the Film Certification Appellate Tribunal, against censorship orders by the CBFC to reverse or modify cuts in the film. However, Prime Minister Modi's government has dissolved the tribunal, which means that all new appeals against the CBFC orders must be made through the State High Court or the Supreme Court of India, an expensive and lengthy ordeal. So to begin, Mr. Thakur, how does censorship stifle a filmmaker's freedom of expression?
I mean, there are two broad components to this question. First is direct, and second is indirect. I'll first start with the direct first. And this bit of the answer is also a bit obvious because, I mean, at a very intuitive level, we understand what film censorship does, right? And just one tiny disclaimer throughout the course of this conversation, when I refer to film censorship, what I'm actually referring to is an unjust system of film censorship. So in that case, I mean, it obviously clamps down on a filmmaker's artistic vision. He or she is not allowed to see certain things in the way they want to, and that obviously has a huge moral impact, a huge impact on the filmmaker's morale, because I mean it really brings us to this really very essential question, right? Which is, what is cinema? I mean, you know, a film is not just plot points, screenwriting jobs. It's not just good performances. It's not just themes or good story. I mean, a good film or a challenging film can be much more than that. It can be something that can be used to, you know, say, challenge the status quo. It can be it can be used to sort of ask uncomfortable questions of the people in the country, of people in power. It's something that can, you know, really broaden the state of conversation in the country by, say, talking about certain things that have historically not been represented on not just Indian screens, or not just on film screens, but also among people in the society. Say, I mean, talking about or tackling certain aspects of India's caste system. Say, tackling about the country's really uncomfortable history with sort of religious bigotry and things like that, right? So I mean, so at a very obvious level, you have this situation where you've been given a directive that, all right, I mean, these things are not allowed, and then you sort of automatically you're working backwards, even while you are making, say, a next film after you've been censored. Because I think one of the most important things about film censorship is that it's not something that happens, say, just in the present or in the moment. It's not something that is, you know, that happens, say, once and you move on. Censorship is an act that sort of stays with you. And I think that is important, because then you are talking about something that can shape future conversations, because that can shape future films. And also, I mean, coming to one of the most important impacts of film censorship is also the fact, something that I mentioned earlier in the answer, is that, you know, a good film sort of broadens the state of conversation in the country. So when you have a culture of rampant film censorship, you are essentially telling filmmakers that, all right, folks, you cannot talk about these bunch of things. So just as a natural extension of that, you are restricting the scope of what can be spoken about, what can be argued, what can be dissected, what can be criticized even. And by that, you are restricting, and that restricted scope of conversation leads to something else. I mean, it leads to a society being less heterogeneous. It leads to a society being less diverse at various levels, right? I mean, at socially, politically, even cinematically. And that is really unfortunate. Now, the second part of the answer, which is indirect impact, is, I think, is, if not more, it is as important as the direct impact, uh, because what happens in such a case is that your psyche starts getting molded. You are automatically working under a certain set of presumptions. Filmmakers start to question themselves. Is this cuss word appropriate? Is this line anti-national? Is this subplot sort of like, will offend a certain section of the mob? And in that case, then, certain filmmakers, and it really, I'm sure, affects a huge portion of filmmakers, because they are also, I mean, reacting to things as people at a very fundamental level. And then what happens is that, as your psyche starts getting molded, you're no longer your own person. You become a part of the mob, and you subconsciously start trying to placate the mob. And we all know that it's impossible to placate a mob. Nobody can placate the mob, not even the mob itself, right? So then these filmmakers are sort of like caught up in a battle which is rigged for them to lose. So, in a way, what we see then is self-censorship. And if you ask me personally, I would say that, censoring is not the goal. Self-censoring is the goal. Because, see, if my first part of the answer was the direct impact is all about controlling actions. The indirect impact is all about controlling thought. Now, you tell me, what is more insidious? What is more harmful to this idea of an inclusive, secular, progressive society? Obviously, when progressive thinkers start policing themselves, and because then you've planted somebody, right? You've planted this some sort of a mole inside the head of a really creative, inventive person, and that is really harmful. I mean, it will not be too far-fetched to sort of invoke the example of George Orwell's, I mean, seminal work, which is 1984, and draw some parallels with the functioning of thought police and thought crime and all of that. And if your actions get say banned or censored or criticized, there's still hope. But if your thoughts are impermissible according to your own self, then I'm sorry. I mean, then we sort of hurtle towards a culture that is really troublesome, I would say. So, I mean, yeah.
Would you mind giving an example of this cycle beginning, either with the 1984 work that you mentioned, or of films that have been censored and then subsequent directors or producers censoring what they then produce as a result of the experience?
Yeah, so I mean, just very recently, I mean, I was just going through a few interviews, and the director of this excellent film called The Disciple, it's streaming on Netflix. It came out earlier this year. He was on a panel discussion. The name of the filmmaker is Chaitanya Tamahane. He was on a panel discussion in the International Film Festival of India earlier this year in January, and he spoke about the dangers of self-censorship. He was actually asked a question about what tips would you give to budding filmmakers, and he said that there are no tips to give because there are only police complaints now. So, I mean, and the fact is that he's a pretty acclaimed young filmmaker. He's made 2 films, although his films did not court controversy, but both his films were screened and won awards at the Venice Film Festival and all of that. So, if there is somebody like him who's not even been, say, overtly, say, banned and controlled like that, if he's saying something, that then, there's more to that. Cut to 2 months later, in March of this year, Alankrita Srivastav. She is this filmmaker whose second film, Lipstick Under My Burqa, in 2016 was banned by the CBFC because, and I'm not making it up, it was a lady-oriented film. So I mean, this is the level of ridiculousness that we are talking about. And she had a recent Netflix piece came out, which is this drama, 5-part drama called Bombay Begums. And in an interview, she was compelled to talk about, the dangers of self-censorship, the dangers of, these thoughts looming over your artistic mindset all the time. But although, I mean, at one point she said that it's great that things like OTT platforms exist because the CBFC cannot touch them. Well, hello, spoiler alert. They are coming for the OTT platforms as well, right? So I mean, there are many examples, but these two examples are really that struck with me. A, because they're very recent, and B, I mean, they sort of involve these filmmakers who are not just very good filmmakers, but also filmmakers who have the potential to make some really nice political films in the future. But I mean, just the fact that they are talking about they're not even talking about censorship, they're talking about self-censorship. And it's something that is quite worrying, I think.
Right. And so in effect, it's this pervasive way of controlling society, not just through strict order, but through finding a way to have society control itself, in effect. Right. And before, we speak about censorship in more of a moral sense, I'd like to ask you about the actual process of how the CBFC edits these movies and creates suggestions for them. Who makes the final decisions? What is that process like for filmmakers?
All right. Yeah, I mean, this is an excellent question. I think this is so important because I remember when I did my first piece. So this is a personal digression, but just it will take just a few lines. So when I was writing my first piece on film censorship, this back in 2014, and I did not. And it was my first year in journalism. And I had a very vague idea of the CBFC, and I thought that like anybody else, that CBFC is this really monolithic body sending out these draconian directives to sort of clamp down on artistic integrity and things like that. It's only when I started to research on the piece, the first thing that I found out was that how little information was there online as to how this whole business of the CBFC, or colloquially speaking, the censor board, works. And the more I dug out, the more surprised I was, because honestly speaking, the overall story is much more nuanced, which we will get into during the course of our discussion. Back to my answer. So it used to comprise of 3 steps. I mean, given that FCAT no longer exists, but I'll still take FCAT into consideration so that it makes for an easy segue into, say, the next set of questions. So the first step is the examining committee. It essentially consists of it's chaired by a CBFC member, and it has 4 people from something called the advisory panel. Now, the second step is the revising committee. It is chaired by the CBFC chairperson, and it is supposed to consist of not more than 9 people from the CBFC board members and people from the advisory panel. Now, the third step was the FCAT, which no longer exists. Now, if I'm a filmmaker and I need a censor board certificate, because that's the norm in India, if your film is supposed to be exhibited publicly, you need to have a censor certificate. So say I submit the film to the censor board, I pay the fee, do all of those things, and then essentially the examining committee sees the movie. If they have problems with it, they will give me what they call a list of suggested cuts. Now I can either agree to it or disagree to it. If there's no consensus, if I think that the examining committee has been particularly unfair, then I move to the revising committee. Now, same with the revising committee, right? I mean, they come to a majority vote, wherein in cases of tied vote, the CBFC chairperson has the veto power and things like that. But let's say even I find that the revising committee has also been particularly unfair to my film, then I could have gone to the FCAT. Now there is no such option, right? Now I directly go to the courts. Now there is one thing that I want to elaborate here, and this is so crucial, And this gets talked about so little, which is why I'll just take a few more minutes to sort of, extrapolate this so that perhaps people get a more nuanced picture of what the CBFC essentially does. Now, I mentioned at one point something called advisory panel, right? So, as I had said, that the examining committee consists 4 people from the advisory panel, and the revising committee also includes some people from the advisory panel with a few people from the CBFC board members, the CBFC members. Now, what is advisory panel? Now, advisory panel is somebody who, an advisory panel is a representative of Indian society. It's supposed to represent a section of the Indian society. Now, who can be a member of the advisory panel? Almost anybody. I mean, so advisory panels are people from all walks of life. They can be doctors, lawyers, homemakers, things like that. So these are quote unquote people like us, normal people who consume cinema as a piece of entertainment and things like that. Now, what is really interesting, something that's really interesting that's happening in the landscape of the CBFC, and that's true for decades now. So the dominant narrative, and I'm not even saying that it's an untrue narrative. Obviously, it's true to a large extent, but there are more things that meet the eye that we should talk about. So the dominant narrative of most censorship bodies, right? It's a narrative of us versus them. It's a narrative of, say, filmmakers versus the censorship body, or say in this case, and given that in India, it's a really important point. The CBFC is controlled by the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting. The Ministry of Information and Broadcasting does everything. It appoints the chairperson, it appoints the people from the advisory panel, used to appoint members from the FCAT, appoints the CBFC members, does the whole thing. So, I mean, when we talk about the CBFC, we may as well be talking about the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, and by that, the central government. Sorry, coming back to the advisory panel. So, now, for decades now, there has been a lot of controversy about the composition of the advisory panel. And it's something that really subverts or punctures this very easy to buy us versus them narrative that I touched upon. Now, in 2018, while I was doing a piece on the CBFC and the FCAT about this legendary controversial Indian film called Bandit Queen, it was a 1995 film, and I'll talk about it in some detail. For that, I spoke to a journalist who happened to be a member, who happened once to be a member of the advisory panel. And she told me some pretty revealing things. She said that, I mean, and it's something that's almost an open secret, but it's, well, I mean, it's not talked about as openly as it should. So she said that many times the members of these advisory committees are political nominees. That these nominations are often done to, in her words, to reward party loyalists. Now, and she also said, as an extension, so a large portion of the examining and the revising committee consists of people who are not as acquainted with the language of cinema, are people who are not as well equipped to sort of, see cinema in its entirety, in its context, and things like that. She recounted this one small anecdote of somebody who would come to these screenings, and he would be sleeping throughout the screenings. There was this one time when they asked a Bengali filmmaker to make a less political film. She said that a lot of members suffered from this sense of superiority. Now, there is also another evidence to sort of back her claim, lest we sort of just dismiss it as one anecdote or something. So in 2002, there was the CBFC chief was this legendary filmmaker called Vijay Anand, hugely respected craftsman, was very massively popular in the 1960s, just a really respected figure. In 2002, this guy said that, he'd proposed 2 radical suggestions. First was that we can have X-rated theaters for movies that are, say, more adult in content and perhaps more, say, erotic films, obviously erotic films and things like that. for which he got a lot of flack, of course, in a country like India, which is just likes to make such a big show of morals and things like that.
Right.
Well, that's a separate story. And the second observation that he made was that he was also, as a CBFC chief, he said that he was massively disappointed by the appointments of these advisory panel members, and he had said that these government sort of induced appointments should be reduced in future. Now, so I was reading this really popular book called Sensorium. I think it's written by an academic at the University of Chicago, if I'm not wrong. And he had said that, and I quote him, that several commentators suggested that it was this suggestion of reducing the scope of the advisory panel that led to the CBFC chief resigning, as opposed to his more radical suggestion of sort of proposing X-rated theaters. Now there are we have two more evidences. In 2013, there was something called a Mugdal committee was made. Now that was made because there was this huge controversial censorship issue around this movie called Vishwarupam, starring this big Indian star called Kamal Hassan. Now, the committee came up with a huge report and all of that, in which, I mean, among many of its suggestions, all of which was summarily ignored, was this one suggestion that the advisory panel, it, 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 it sort of like very categorically, it had commented on the quality of the panel and how these panels come into being, and saying that that again their sort of quality leaves a lot to be desired. So there you have. Then 3 years later, there was this another committee by this again a veteran Indian filmmaker called Shyam Benegal, which produced this humongous report analyzing the landscape of Indian film censorship in the country. Wherein one of its many recommendations was that it echoed the views of the Mugdal committee, saying that these appointments really lack a really crucial filmmaking understanding and all of that. It had gone as far as to say that these appointments should not be done by the government, but they should be done by distinguished film bodies such as, say, National Film Development Corporation of India, Film Federation Society of India, things like that. So I mean, there are enough evidences that spotlight a slightly different aspect of the CBFC as well, that it's not as simplistic as, say, us versus them. At times the common Indian people, the common Indian population, has also been a significant roadblock in the censorship process. And now this is something that people don't talk a lot about, because the thing is, if you start talking about, say, the common people or the ordinary people and all of that, they will very quickly dismiss you as being elitist. But let me just very quickly clarify that I'm not being that here. I'm just saying that I mean, what are institutions? Institutions are made of people, and who are these people is something that we should be talking about when we talk about the complete story of the CBS.
Of course. You mentioned the level of clientelism and patronage of members of the advisory board as people who are very fervent party supporters. I'm curious, does wealth and business interest play a large role in who gets appointed on these committees? Are the appointment of these committees kind of being self-selected to people in the population who would rather avoid portrayal of certain industries or geographic regions as problematic or impoverished in that sense?
I think it's very much possible. I mean, I can't give you concrete data or facts, because there's been no study or something like that done by somebody else, or for that matter, I don't have a considerable sample size of, say, advisory panel members who have confided in me, say, anonymously. So I mean, so there is that bit there as well. But that said, though, I mean, obviously, right, just think about it intuitively. If you are picking people from a random section of the population, which I don't think is a bad idea, I think it's a good idea. It's something that works, that can work in theory, but we often know that it's easier said than done. And in fact, there was this one case, as far as I remember, it had nothing to do with the advisory panel, but it was related to charges of corruption with respect to a very prominent CBFC person in the past, I think a decade ago or something, taking bribes to sort of like, give favorable certification to a film and things like that. So that aspect, obviously, we know. But when it comes to, the advisory panel, the composition of the advisory panels, and with it, this sense of inherent selection or a certain kind of latent discrimination, as you very rightly point out, is is something that I'm sure hampers the process considerably. And I don't want to take a moral high ground here. I'm pretty sure many people, me included, we have certain biases that we don't know about unless we are faced with it, right? So I can go on to say that, oh, I'm this really progressive person and things like that. But I can give it to you in writing that things that I really haven't thought throughout. And if it's something that I see on cinema, I don't know how I'll react, right? And given the fact that there are people, advisory panel members, who themselves say that the selection can be so haphazard that it sort of starts impeding the real objective of film censorship, is something. And it's something that I've also heard from several filmmakers during the course of my reporting, wherein they've said that it's impossible to sort of dispute, debate, engage with the people of the examining committee. They say that the revising committee is still better because it consists of people from the industry, people who are filmmakers themselves as screenwriters, sometimes then film critics. So they understand that making art is a messy business,
Right.
as opposed to, somebody just sort of wallowing in this shallow sense of power where they can just dictate terms to a filmmaker.
Right. That makes sense. That makes sense to you. The specialized expertise actually matters in these cases. You've mentioned a few times the abolition of the film certification appellate tribunal. So I just wanted to ask, what does the abolition of the FCAT by the government of India, what does that mean for filmmakers, and whether it's so far it's seeming that it is a political decision, but I'm curious your thoughts on that statement.
Yeah, so as I sort of briefly touched upon my last answer, the FCAT, as you would have ascertained, it was a very crucial gap. It filled a really crucial gap between the CBFC and the courts. Because FCAT was often it was a 4-member team and things like that. And it was often chaired by a retired high court judge and all of that. It often comprised people from the film industry, really senior members at times, and things like that, which really gave the filmmakers a much needed relief with respect to a possibility of a certain kind of an impartial and fair hearing to a really large extent. So
Right.
the removal of that has been a major blow. Now, there's also a second point that is as important, which is going to approaching courts in India, as I'm sure most people know, is an expensive and a time-consuming process. Now, there are a lot of commercial considerations when it comes to releasing a film, right? And that's where also is one chapter of the Indian film censorship, or I'm pretty sure of most film censorship stories across cultures in the world, that filmmaking is both art and is also a money making enterprise, and it's often the latter that kind of poses a certain kind of specific roadblocks in the process. So coming back to my answer, as I said, given that approaching courts is a expensive and a time consuming process, FCAT was great because it could give you proper results in say a week or two, and because of and thus saving filmmakers from huge financial losses, because oftentimes your book theaters, your trailers are out, you've spent considerable amount on say ads and things like that, right? There's a certain buzz about the film and all of that. It's not the same as the film releasing say 6 months later, 8 months later. A lot goes behind in thinking about the timing of the film and stuff like that, right? So FCAT was absolutely great with respect to these things. Now, was FCAT perfect? Obviously not. I'll give you an example. In 2014, I believe, if I have the year right, there was this documentary called or 2016. I'm not sure about the year. I'm sorry. I think it's 2014. Anyway, sorry. So there was this one documentary called In Dino Muzaffarnagar. It was this controversial documentary on the 2013 Muzaffarnagar riots. Muzaffarnagar happens to be a place in the northern uh, province of the country, and it was a hugely controversial topic in which, I mean, dozens of lives were lost and things like that. Examining committee and the revising committee rejected the film outright. Just, I mean, they gave a pretty outlandish reasons. But what was disappointing was that even FCAT refused to certify the film, and that is a movie that remains uncertified till date. And it's so that said, though, FCAT was still a process that sort of um, worked by and large overall. Now I'll just give you an example. So I spoke about the Bandit Queen. I spoke about Bandit Queen in my last answer, saying that it was this hugely controversial but also superbly made. I mean, cinematically, it premiered at the Cannes Film Festival in 1995, in '94, I think. It got great reviews from critics all over the world and all of that. And but when it came to India, it was the examining committee and the revising committee imposed an inordinate amount of cuts. I mean, I think the revising committee asked for as close to around 100 cuts, because there
Wow.
were lots of scenes involving, I mean, violence against, say, women and all of that. There was a lot of caste slurs and all of that. But obviously, it was based on a true story, and it was telling a particular story without compromising on its grittiness and how disturbing it was. And it was FCAT, in fact, that sort of rescued the film. And in fact, the retired the head of the FCAT for that particular case was the retired High Court judge, and he had said something really memorable. He had suggested the censor board representative to take a trip to Khajuraho. Now, Khajuraho happens to be this temple, this really old, I mean, or medieval temple in the state called Madhya Pradesh, which is, I mean, at the center of the country, if I can approximate it like that. And it is a temple which has these really sexually explicit images of adorned on its walls and all of that. It's probably the only temple in India that does not well look like a temple in the way we are supposed to think of it as. I hope that does not get me into trouble. So he said that, the FCAT judge had said that I suggest that the censor board representative take a trip to Khajuraho to understand the difference between nakedness, nudity, and obscenity. That you cannot outright say that this is unacceptable, or this offends, and things like that. You cannot take expletives literally. You have to evaluate scenes in their right context, and things like that. So Bandit Queen, I mean, even 25 years later, remains a revolutionary judgment. And uh, I spoke to its producer for a piece 2 years ago, and he told me that had the film been made today, he had absolutely no hope of it getting a release.
Really?
So that says so much. And yeah, I mean, that's not an exaggeration at all, from in my own limited experience of having covered the Indian film industry over the last 8 years. I mean, that's not an exaggeration at all. Now, coming back to the second part of the question, which is this decision politically motivated? Short answer, yes. Long answer, uh, will require us to sort of take a look at the timing of the decision. So this was abolished in April this year, literally a little more than 2 months ago. And it's really important that we sort of consider the timing of this decision. So what so as I mean, as I sort of explained in my previous answers, I mean, the Indian films have been historically, being sort of controlled by the CBFC, and by that extension, the Central Board of Film Certification, the CBFC. So, I mean, you can very clearly see that how film censorship is a state project, how it is such a political project right from its very inception. So that part is really important to this answer. But something happened over the last 3 years, which is this massive influx of these OTT players coming into the country, right? So now we have almost more than 40 OTT players, including obviously the big ones such as Netflix, Hotstar Plus, Disney, Amazon Prime Video, and many more, of course. Now, over the last and given the fact that Indian cinema has been so heavily and overtly controlled by the state, uh, Indian filmmakers could not make certain kinds of films. And this all ties into our discussions about self-censorship and overt censorship. So, for instance, India has had very few political films over its last more than 7 decades of independence and stuff like that. Indian films don't really talk about caste as much. Indian films really don't talk about bigotry as much, and religious bigotry as much, and things like that. All of that started to change over the last 3 years when you had these some excellent shows which were not under the ambit of Ministry of INB. So Netflix could technically show or produce or greenlight projects on shows that were pretty bold, and it did. Not just Netflix, but also Amazon. We had like a slew of shows only over the last 3 years, which tackled some excellent diverse themes such as Islamophobia, institutional bigotry, and casteism and things like that, questioning the status quo, talking about say the government, not perhaps in such a direct way, because of course people are still scared even if their stuff is not being very directly monitored by the INB. So that was that, and as these shows started to come online, and as the pandemic hit us last March, you know these shows started to get heavily trolled by a certain section of Twitter users. I mean, they were, and one of the most famous insights was that these shows are Hindu phobic, that they sort of, degenerate Hindu customs, idols, the great Indian culture, and things like that. And but the fact is, the Indian government just could not do anything about it. So for a really long time, you could get a very distinct sense that the narrative of censorship is moving away from them, right? Like now, who is to stop a really young subversive filmmaker to sort of make something that really challenges the dominant narrative? So I think the abolition of FCAT, and then last November, it passed the central government passed an order that all the OTT platforms will now, in the future, be monitored by the Ministry of INB. So there's no difference now. I mean, they are yet to, release like really formal directives and things like that. So the abolition of FCAT, which are just so sudden and all of that, I think is just a piece of this gigantic story and very ever evolving story about film censorship that we have come to see over the last year or two. So yes, definitely politically motivated in the sense I get.
So in addition to, further regulating these streaming services and putting them to the ministry, there's an even bigger emphasis on censorship of traditional Indian media and filmmaking as well. That's interesting. And so for the films that are released uncensored, what are the pros and cons and potential effects of such a move by filmmakers?
I'll give you a few examples. So it's also a great question because we have exact data points that we can sort of compare the effects of what happens if something quote unquote offensive is out there in the public domain, which was not the case when there were no OTT platforms, where there were just theaters and there were just the old fashioned way of CBFC censoring. Those films would just disappear, or those filmmakers would have to cut those scenes out and all of that. In some cases, they would approach courts. Some of them would win, but that was really not the norm, so to speak. So so as I was saying, we've had OTT platforms in the country for quite some time, of course, but the game really started to change with this series called Sacred Games. It's based on a massively popular novel by Vikram Chandra. But the novel came out in the early 2000s, and it just went on to win. It is a huge international success as well. Anyway, and that's a novel that sort of tackles, it interrogates Hindu fundamentalism in some penetrating detail and things like that. Anyway, so Sacred Games was the first long form storytelling piece that hit the Indian OTT landscape. Before that, Netflix, Amazon, they would mostly have films, or and also because it was an important project because two of India's really acclaimed directors made it, Anurag Kashyap and Vikramaditya Motwane, and it starred two massively popular stars, Saif Ali Khan and Nawazuddin Siddiqui. I mean, these are household names. So, and now after that, the success of Sacred Games, it got favorable reviews from all across, not just in India, but from different publications across the world and all of that. And so that really led to, a spurt in sort of long format storytelling, something Indian directors had not been given the freedom of, and it was almost, and of course they lapped it up with both hands. I mean, it was almost the sense that that you are in a class being sort of monitored by this really strict teacher, and he or she is just monitoring your every move. You're being castigated at every step. You are being, all of that, and suddenly the teacher vanishes. Now suddenly you can do anything in the class, and this burst of freedom was, it felt empowering to me as an audience member, as a critic, because I thought that finally India can also make things that can cross, say, a Narcos, say, stuff in different languages and things like that. And finally, your audiences across the world will perhaps see the true power of Indian storytelling, because a lot of it was being squashed even before it could begin, because of how the CBFC used to function. So, I mean, over the next 3 years, continuing till now, we had like a slew of shows. I mean, at least a good 10 to 12 shows, a good dozen shows that, sort of went into different recesses of Indian society and politics and culture that we don't talk about, and not just as a society, but also as a filmmaking community, also as a country, and things like that. Now, when that started to happen, it started to ruffle some feathers. And you remember, I mean, in the last answer, I was talking about, that certain shows have been heavily criticized by a certain section of people on Twitter. And I'll be very kind to them, so I'll only call them trolls. So, I mean, that is a very obvious offshoot of it. I mean, so before that, right? I mean, the CBFC would at times ban films on whims. I mean, there would be one or two quote unquote fringe religious group that would have problems against this. A certain film, a certain depiction, and all of that, and there's almost this sense of moral panic that, oh my God, if this film releases, India will cease to exist tomorrow. I mean, this is how we sort of equate censorship to this sense of unstoppable calamity that will just poison our children. It will just kill our culture, which is of course so great and so good. Everybody. So this is a great example. I'll go into some bit of granular details about some of the examples and the concerns around it. But before that, I will just say that, all right, so there were these 10-12 shows, and these were shows that were criticized by a certain section of the society. What happened to what did those shows create? Something that were, I mean, did they create, say, communal disharmony? Did they incite some sort of violence? This is often the reason that's given for censoring something, that this is something that threatens the sovereignty of the country. It's literally one of the directives in the CBFC manual, that if you find that's the case, please ban the film, or ask for cuts. In these cases, and these examples are for all of us to see. I mean, nothing happened. Nothing happened. I mean, a few nut jobs got irritated, annoyed, and their feelings were offended. To
Right.
which, I mean, I am compelled to quote a scene from Reservoir Dogs. Uh, I play a small violin for that offended feelings. I mean, it's just ridiculous. It's you really get to see that it. I mean, I'm obviously not saying that film censorship is not important in certain cases, that we should do away with it and things like that. But what I'm also saying that these shows are an excellent example of the exaggerated moral panic that has engulfed India and all the and has hijacked nuanced conversations about Indian film censorship for decades. Now, I'll give you a few examples. There are so there was this show called Mirzapur, its second season, which premiered on Amazon Prime Video last year in November. Somebody filed a police complaint against the show, saying that it's a show that's about gangsters. It's about a particular region,
Mhm.
it's a small provincial town in Uttar Pradesh in India, and it shows. I mean, think of it as, I mean, a scaled down version of, say, Godfather
Right.
in
Okay.
a small town of Uttar Pradesh. Now, obviously, if it's a show about gangsters, now you can't have people who are chanting. I mean, I don't know, religious sermons and all of that. I mean, the man has a gun; he will go for the kill. I mean, it's, it's as simple as that. The cuss words. I mean, whatever. But somebody filed a police complaint saying that it shows Uttar Pradesh in a bad light. That was
Mm.
that. There was this another show which created a huge controversy, this show called Tandav, which premiered this January on Amazon Prime Video. There was this a scene in which a student activist refers to a Hindu god in a play, and trust me, there was absolutely nothing offensive about it. But a bunch of these groups took offense, and they wanted an apology from the filmmaker and all of that. And also, what's really disturbing is that when it comes to the narrative of Indian film censorship, you all the time you're reading between the lines. Now,
Mm.
what's important to note in the case of Tandav, now I'll just backtrack and tell you something about Mirzapur. Now, Mirzapur is a show based in Uttar Pradesh. It
Mhm.
is Uttar Pradesh is controlled by this guy called Yogi Adityanath. He was previously, he's the chief minister of the state. He's massively popular amongst the ranks of the supporters of the Bharatiya Janata Party, which is the party of India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and all of that. So that bit of context is important when we think about something like Mirzapur. Now, with respect to Tandav, when this controversy came up, or was manufactured, uh, you know. What was really disturbing was that the director of the show is a
Mhm.
Muslim. The main
Mhm.
actor of the show is a star who also starred in Sacred Games, is a Muslim. The guy who said those offensive dialogues is a Muslim.
Mm.
And it was sort of made a, an example of, and several of the offending parties said that what then why don't they make scenes about other religions? Why do they have to target Hindus and things like that?
Mm.
Now, what's really unfortunate was that the director of the web series actually apologized,
Mm.
and he deleted those scenes, and
Oh.
he thanked the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting for its support and guidance. That is that. Now, there's this another series which premiered on Netflix, A Suitable Boy. I'm sure you have heard of the novel A Suitable Boy, again a massive international success and all of that. It premiered last November.
Mhm.
Now, it had now people went nuts about a scene in the series, because it had a Muslim boy
Mhm.
and a Hindu a woman kissing against the backdrop of a temple, and
Mm.
they were just absolutely outraged. How is this possible? This is a case of a love jihad, and love jihad is something that just doesn't exist. I would ask you to wiki it, but I mean, again, such an interreligious union is called love jihad, which is, I mean, the name explains it. So that's another example. You remember I spoke about this example of a filmmaker who spoke about self-censorship, whose
Right.
second film was banned for being lady-oriented, Alankrita
Mm-hmm.
Srivastava. Now she came up with this series called Bombay Begums, and the National Commission for Protection of Child Rights found issues in it because it thought that it showed minors indulging in casual sex and doing drugs, and it thought that basically, I mean, it's a conversation that's so prevalent across cultures, right? That depiction is not endorsement necessarily,
Mm-hmm.
and obviously things like context and all that are important. So that happened. Then I mean, there's this another show called Patal Lok, which came last year. That was again a fairly political show, and it sort of spoke about a bunch of things, say Islamophobia and caste related issues and stuff like that. That show managed that is an interesting show because it's really a rare example of an equal opportunity offender. So it managed to offend Hindus, it managed to offend Sikhs, it managed to offend a Gurkha group. So and it's yeah, and I can go on and on. There are many examples, several more examples, and so you can sort of see this really rough narrative that of these vigilante censor board, self-appointed censor board members. And I mean, I was kind of just going through before this interview. I was just kind of going through these complaints and all of that, and and something that I found interesting was that it's they all call for an outright ban. They, they,
Oh,
there is no attempt to engage. There is no attempt to sort of talk about it in some more detail and things like that. So I mean, there you have it. I mean, what will happen if such an incendiary film will be in public? A few people will rant about it, and a few days later, it will just be a new day. I mean, yeah.
do you find that most of the complaints come from like the Hindu majority group or from minority groups in the region,
Yeah,
or
yeah,
is it?
absolutely. I mean, absolutely. You can, I can be accused of being a Hindu-phobic liberal, but I'll just also, I mean, balance that answer with saying that, I mean, in a country where say 75 or 80% of the population are Hindus, it kind of makes some mathematical or statistical sense that the
Mm-hmm.
ratio of those complaints would be higher. That said, though, I mean, let's be real and let's talk about, well, the cows in the room. Sorry. I mean, it's yeah. I mean, there is this knee-jerk tendency of just being so self-defensive of anything is out there to get them, and it's really laughable at times. There is this thing called, I mean, there's this one line that they often quote in Hindi. I'll translate it. In Hindi, it's called Hindu khatre mein hai, which basically translates to Hindus are in danger. So it's this perpetual sense of being obviously there are parallels there, right? I mean, in the US itself. I mean, I need not elaborate on that.
Right.
So I mean, so yes, I mean, there is this massive sense of manufactured victimization that's happening, and they are absolutely all out there to sort of, I mean, to get these people. I mean, they want these filmmakers to be arrested, they want these filmmakers to be put behind bars with, like,
Mhm.
non-bailable warrants and things like that. So yeah, it's a really sad state of affairs when it comes to that.
Right. We've mentioned a lot about, things that are considered offensive and meant to be censored. But I just want to sort of explicitly talk about what is considered offensive by the CBFC and the role of morality in the censorship, and whether the CBFC is typically more conservative or more religiously leaning in their approach towards cinema and morality.
Yeah, I mean, so there are again two broad aspects to this answer, and so there are basically two broad kinds of panic which leads to
Mhm.
a rampant culture of censorship in the country. The first kind of panic is moral. So moral panic can just encompass anything that is say related to things such as sexual orientation. It could be about religion. It could be about region. It could be about caste. As I gave a few examples in my last answer, uh, that is a pretty representative set of what really sort of worries the the CBFC. So that's that. Now, over the last 7 years, after Prime Minister Narendra Modi has come to power, we have started to see a new kind of panic, and I would like to call that as political panic. You know, and political panic is quite simply anything that goes against the interests of the nation, anything that can make you quote unquote an anti-national, and that is something that has become really troublesome. So these are I would say, I mean, these two broad things under which that are more sort of immediate, are felt as more immediate and grievous threats to the culture and the sanity of the country, and all sorts of rhetoric and all sorts of mechanisms are sort of deployed by the CBSE to make sure that the Indian public doesn't get to watch those things. Now, what was the second part of your question? Sorry.
Just discussing like how has the CBFC been conservative in their ideas of cinema and morality, which you've kind of
it's really interesting. I mean, I'll also just take a hopefully a brief detour into just talking a bit about the history of Indian film censorship, because when we are talking about say a historical mindset of a censorship body in the country, I mean, what does it A really mean, and B, where does it come from? So I mean, obviously, like most awful things in our country, the film censorship is also a gift from our colonial masters, which is the Britishers. And it's really interesting because I spoke about the political panic right now, right? Which has really been the flavor of the season for the last 7 years, and anything that is deemed that is considered anti-national is sniped by the CBFC board. Well, that was one of the exact reasons why the Britishers established film censorship in the country. I mean, it was established in 1918 because they did not want anything, because they obviously understood, and film was a new medium then. It had barely completed 2 decades in the world, the medium of cinema, and they were very cognizant, right? They very rightly knew that what can a great political film do to the consciousness of the people, right? And how cinema can be such an effective political tool of political propaganda, or of this sense of political mobilization, which sort of no leader, no matter how powerful he or she may be, would be able to achieve so effortlessly as a piece of cinema, as a piece of charged cinema can do in an hour or two. So I mean, uh, they had like some three broad tenets that they had at the back of their mind while regulating films in the country. I mean, first is obviously, I mean, anything that was anti-national, or anything that was, and obviously there was no country then. So when we say anti-national, we essentially mean anti-Britishers. Anything that sort of showed an effusive outpouring of nationalist sentiments was sort of absolutely banned. And third, quite interestingly, was Mahatma Gandhi. They, in fact, the first film to be banned by the Britishers in the country in 1921 was this film called Bhakt Vidur, which was essentially a film in which the protagonist very closely resembled or was modeled after Mahatma Gandhi, as far as I remember. In fact, that's not just one example. 18 years later, in 1939, there was this another movie called Tyag Bhumi, which was again, I mean, the protagonist is very clearly, evidently modeled on Gandhi, and that is a film that gets banned by the censorship bodies and all of that. So you can very clearly see, and it is so terribly ironical and so awfully depressing to be living in a country and being, say, such a cinephile like I am, or I'm sure like there are millions of like people like me in the country, uh, uh, that you are sort of taking clues from such a terribly regressive, self-serving colonial law to to sort of further your own interests, right? As say the central government or the ruling party and things like that. So I mean, so that was that. Now I'll come to another point, which is how has cinema been viewed in the country before we sort of tackle the whole aspect of whether the CBFC has been historically, say, regressive and all of that. And again, I mean, if we talk about pre-independent India, and if we talk about, say, the three modern architects of the country, of the post-independent India, I mean, three people very obviously come to mind. One is obviously Mahatma Gandhi. Second is Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. And third is Jawaharlal Nehru, India's first prime minister. Now, the attitudes of these three people with respect to cinema, forget censorship, cinema was drastically different. And something that that really reflects the attitude of people for cinema in the country, because you have to remember that cinema was a fairly a new medium then and all of that. So I mean, Gandhi absolutely hated cinema. He was like, this I don't have to do anything with this. So fine. So there's this Gandhi. Ambedkar was polar opposite, as Ambedkar has often been with respect to Gandhi and a few of his views. Ambedkar really thought that cinema is something that can be a really progressive medium and all of that, and it can really further the social cause in some way. Pandit Nehru was somewhere in between. He thought that cinema can be used as a pedagogical tool. It's something that can serve the nation and all of that. Now, the CBFC is established in 1952, a few years after the independence, and obviously Nehru retains these feelings about cinema. He's pretty I mean, on the fence about it. And in fact, I remember sometime in the 50s, early 50s, I think, if I'm not wrong, there was this huge protest by the citizens against offensive content in Indian films, calling to ban the exhibition of certain kinds of films in the country. I think Nehru got involved and things like that. So I think it's really important before we consider talking about the outlook of the CBFC, and keeping in mind the composition of advisory panel, wherein the people from regular folks from society can often push forward a regressive sort of agenda. Yes, I mean, now finally I've come to the answer. Wow, I'm so sorry. Of course, I mean, the CBFC is again just it's not something by itself, right? CBFC is also a part of the society, and it has very much played that part of being this cultural custodian, of being this something that should not offend people, and something that should always be be looked after. And there is this one terrible thing about the CBFC which persists till date, and it has, and I would go as far as to say that the CBFC has a lot, it shares very some major commonalities with the Indian parents, in the sense that they have a terribly paternalistic, awfully condescending approach towards cinema. And they treat audiences like 8-year-old kids who can't think on their own. Apologies to 8-year-old kids. I'm pretty sure you can. I'll choose a different number, whatever. But so it's that. It's always been that. During emergency, during Prime Minister Indira Gandhi's rule, which lasted from 1935 to 77, there was obviously, I mean, blanket ban on several films. But even before and even after that, the CBFC has been very, very, I mean, conservative and just erring on the side of caution, which, I mean, it does not need to. So, yeah.
I'm curious, you spoke about, colonialist British attitudes on like the political subject matter and censorship. Do you see the more conservative sense of Indian morality as a remnant of colonialist attitudes, or is that like a traditionally like Indian sensibility?
I think it's an interesting question, and I must admit it's a question that I have as interested as I am in several self-serving manufactured Indian myths that we like to spin around us. I haven't given this question a considered thought. So I mean, I'm just wondering out loud here. I would like to think it's a mix of both, right? I mean, there is this obvious sense of persecution that comes among a certain group of Indian conservatives, where it's just about this sense of being victimized by, say, Muslims or say Muslim rulers who started coming to India in from 1100 onwards and all of that. Perhaps a few of them as tourists or as scholars were there before as well, and all of that. So they have this sense of feeling that this land belongs to us, which is often the root cause of many strands of conservatism. I mean, some of it can be found in American conservatism as well. What is America, or who is an American, right? So I mean, so this sense of India's just gloriously very interesting past, and it's a past that as an Indian I'm quite proud of, that that there have been a beautiful amalgamation of different cultures and all that, but obviously that has led to a certain kind of response, which explains, I think, one part of Indian conservatism. I think second is obviously, I think, this sense of emasculation that a large population feels. I mean, obviously because, I mean, not just because of Muslim invaders, but also because of Britishers who ruled the country for 200 years and things like that. And then when you finally get independence, true independence can at times can be really terrifying, which is the story of our country for the last 73 years. So, I mean, it's not a very scholarly answer, but it's just it's a great question. I'll kind of think about it more.
Yeah, no, I think that as an outsider from the whole situation, it's interesting to think like to what extent are these attitudes, remnants of colonialism and just, or inherent attitudes to like Hinduism or other parts of culture. Just circling back to what's on topic, we spoke a lot about new types of media on the internet and streaming services. How do you view the CBFC and censorship evolving and adapting over the next, say, decade or even beyond?
I mean, it's an interesting question, and I wish I could give you a more hopeful answer. But so it's also difficult to predict this with any kind of accuracy. Also because, as I said, the film censorship in India has always been a political project. Right. Now, since we have this right-wing Hindu nationalist chauvinist party at the center for the last 7 years, the Bharatiya Janata Party, we are seeing a certain facet of the CBFC. We are seeing a certain kind of directives. We're seeing a certain kind of things that have suddenly become like, impermissible on Indian screens and all of that. Now, that can change. Now that can change in 2024 if we have a new party at the center, and if they have a different set of ideology, right? Now, what if, like, say, a left party comes to power? God knows that will never happen, but I mean, sorry, it's just, the fact is that the CBFC has been used as a political tool for parties irrespective of their ideologies. I mean, it's something that was made to control filmmaking in this country. And every party has done it. Congress has done it. The BJP has done it. I mean, any other party that will come to power, they will do it. Now, so then you have, I mean, the face of the CBFC, its moralities, its progressiveness, its politics, all of that will change with respect to what their masters tell them to do. Now, say if in 2024 a different government comes to power, now suddenly, I mean, there could be a possibility that you will have a different kinds of things that will be unacceptable. So it's difficult to say. That said, though, I mean, the influx of the OTT platforms and the eagerness with which the government wants to, control it, and such a public backlash against by trolls on social media about like these Hindu phobic or whatever content. uh, gives me a sense that, as rapidly as technology progresses, and again, it's also a difficult question to answer because we don't know. I
Right.
mean, how our world will look like in 10 years. I mean, given the insane rapidity at which big tech is making our lives, well, I mean,
Mhm.
complicated, and I'm being really charitable to them. It's who knows what the streaming landscape would look like. What new complications will it throw, and how will it challenge the very stringent structure of the CBFC? Say now, the OTT platforms have come under the purview of the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting. Maybe something else will come up 10 years later. Maybe they will, so I kind of get the sense that we'll see this increased back and forth, and between sort of a ruling party and say tech companies, filmmakers, and all of that. So it's but I'm not very hopeful at all. Yeah,
Mm.
I think things will probably get worse.
Mm.
I hope not, obviously, but
You're
I mean, yeah.
pessimistic. Yeah. And, continuing that pessimism, you spoke earlier about the dangers of self-censorship in the current movie industry in India. How prevalent do you think it is right now, and how has it changed over time?
It's quite prevalent. I mean, and it's prevalent in a way that things have happened in, say, there have been discrete instances over the last several years, at least, if we are talking about what's happening now. But before I tackle that, I mean, obviously, self censorship has been quite sort of prevalent in our country, because, I mean, it's as I mentioned in my earlier part of the earlier part of the interview, that it's one of the reasons that, we see very few political films in our country. In fact, I was talking to a friend the other day, and she happens to be a big fan of this Netflix series Crown. And I said that, is there a possible? I said that, it would be so cool to have a crown-like treatment to, say, the Gandhi family. The
Yeah.
Gandhi and the Nehru family, the India's original dynast, and all of that. And there was an awkward silence between us. Then we looked at each other and we laughed, and we said that, like hell, that's going to happen. So
Yeah.
often, I think, it's unthinkable. It's unthinkable.
Mm.
So I mean, that just goes to show. I mean, you can just take a look, and I'm not saying that India has not made some great films and all of that, obviously. But the fact is that a lot of filmmakers know that there are certain things you can't touch. I
Mhm.
mean, it's one of the reasons that, very few films take the names of, political leaders, either current or from the past, and things like that in their films, because they know that this is inevitably going to, either get banned, censored, rake up a huge controversy, and things like that. So there is that at the level of, say, art. I mean, and as I gave you the example of, the emergency and all of that, there were three films that had come under a huge. I mean, and they were not allowed to release and all of that. And there have been examples over the next several decades where, I mean, because I often feel that, film censorship is also a form of language, because by censoring films, and given that it's almost quasi controlled by the Ministry of INB, when a film is censored, that is a very short way in which the Ministry of INB is not just talking to that particular filmmaker, it is also talking to a community of filmmakers.
Right.
It is sending a message out that, boss, this is not allowed. If
Mhm.
you make this, we will make an example out of you. And things like that. And so I think it's a very it's an example of, say, coded or a subliminal messaging that this fate will sort of, like, awaits you. Now,
Mhm.
cut to the last decade. Right now, the last decade is obviously marked by the influx of, as I keep saying, OTT players, iTunes, Google Play, Netflix, Amazon, and all of that. Now, you would think that in such a scenario, there would be a case where when these players are not regulated by the Ministry of I&B, they would really revel in that opportunity and sort of like hit a home run. The fact that wow, we have this opportunity where we don't have to be worried about censorship at all, something that has never happened in the history of the country. You will be surprised. I mean, in 2012 and 2013, if I have the years right, iTunes, Apple Store, and Google Play, their catalog of films were censored. And I think if not all, but a major portion of those films were censored by the CBFC itself. Now that is bizarre, if you ask me. I mean, because they did not even need it in the first place. But and we are talking about 2012 and 13 when OTT platforms did not even come to the country, right? Or did not make a presence, huge splash in a way they have over the last several years. So that is one example. Now, I'll give you a few examples of overt self-censorship, which is just infuriating and exasperating. Amazon Prime Video. They reduced the runtime of at least 4 shows. Two were Hindi films, The Dirty Picture, Hunter, and these were films that had some amount of explicit sexual content. Nobody asked them to censor those things; they censored it themselves. Then there was this show I think called The Dirty. No, sorry. There was this show called The Grand Tour. Now there was which Amazon Prime had like cut substantial portions of, because I think it apparently, I have not seen the show, but it apparently has a car which is made out of cow meat, and that sounds interesting. So that's that example. So you have Amazon Prime Video. Now let's talk about Netflix. Now Netflix censored huge portions of, or some portions of, this movie called Angry Indian Goddesses, and all of these examples that I'm giving are from the last few years. So it's not as if I'm talking about some good old past or whatever. These are pretty contemporary examples. So Netflix censored some portions of this movie called Angry Indian Goddesses. Hotstar removed a controversial episode of this show called Coffee with Karan, in which two Indian cricketers had said something not racist, I think that made some sexist and misogynistic comments. Hotstar had also censored an acclaimed Indian film that had won an award at Cannes. It's this movie called Masan. It's a 2015 film. While playing for its viewers, while it screens all the stuff such as, say, Game of Thrones and all these big ticket items, these Western big ticket items without censorship. So that's obviously, that's pretty double standard. Then there was this another example, and the most famous one. Last summer, John Oliver did a piece on Narendra Modi, criticizing the Indian Prime Minister severely and all of that, whatever. Hotstar removed that episode. All these instances, yeah, it was a huge deal and stuff like that, So all these instances are these blatant examples of self-censorship, as much as so much so that the Internet and Mobile Association of India, it's essentially an industry body for OTT platforms and all of that. They came up with their own guidelines in late 2018 or early 2019 to regulate their own content, because Indian TV also functions like that. Indian TV doesn't come under the purview of the CBFC and all of that. It more or less follows a self-regulatory model and all of that. Self-censorship is rampant there. So much so that there was this one example that of a scene from Matrix in 2014. Playing in 2014, I think on Hotstar, that blurred the cleavage of Monica Bellucci. So there's several examples. It's quite nutty like that. So anyway, so they actually approached. So these bodies, they formed a union of sorts or whatever, and they approached the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting with their own set of guidelines, saying that we will follow these things and all of that, and we will take care of our own selves and all of that. Of course, the ministry did not agree to it, as far as I remember, because obviously they had something else in mind. So yeah, I mean, there you have it. There was this. If in an environment of an ideal environment where you are unencumbered from the diktats of the CBFC, you have a situation where these big tech platforms. I mean, we're talking about Amazon. We're talking, sure, Netflix not big tech, but I mean, you get the point, right? I mean, it's these huge players are scared, and they have gone on to sort of self-censor themselves, including, of course, Google and Apple.
Mm-hmm.
It just says everything, right? And coupled with, I mean, a few comments that I supplied from these really promising young Indian filmmakers talking about, the scope of self-censorship and all of that. I am pretty sure if there's an anonymous poll conducted where you could anonymously answer this one question: is the pall of self-censorship too much for you to bear as an Indian filmmaker? I think the 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 percentage of people who would say yes to that would probably exceed 70-80%. I mean, that's my guess, of course, but
Yeah.
because yeah.
Do you think that self-censorship or the urge to self-censor is more motivated by fear of political bodies like the CBFC or public outcry?
I think it's more political because I mean, because I mean, at the end of the day, as it said, it's also filmmaking is also some sort of a money making enterprise. It's also, I mean, it's not just you or your artistic vision and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
There are also, I mean, somebody who's produced the film, somebody, I mean, there are hundreds of people involved in making of the film and all of that, and that becomes especially important if you're an independent filmmaker in India, because unlike, say, France and all of that, the Indian government does not really support filmmaking in any sense, which also becomes so important. So then that creates a culture of fear, because you don't want to get into the limelight too often, because then you will be billed as a certain kind of a filmmaker. You will be then your second film or third film will be seen with so much with much increased scrutiny, and they will find things in your film which you had not even intended, or like they will make your family drama movie political, controversial, and things like that. So I think, I mean, I'm hazarding a guess to some extent, but I think the fear of public outcry is not as much as the fear of falling out of favors, or being seen as a certain kind of filmmaker in the light of the government of your country, and it's really difficult to go against your government, especially when you know that there is a certain kind of culture that's sort of really pervasive,
Mm-hmm.
that goes after artistic freedom day in and day out. So I think that political fear is more potent, in my opinion.
Understood. And to wrap this all up, I wanted to get your opinion on, say, we created a blank slate in the film and censorship arena, and you could design a system that completely changes what's currently happening with the CBFC. What does an ideal climate look like for you? What is the ideal version of the film industry and of any potential censorship or no potential censorship? What would that look like for you?
That's an excellent question, and it's something that has been spoken about. I mean, I spoke about the 2013 and the 2016 reports. Just talking about exactly this: that how should the CBFC be revised? And I would say there is, and the answer that I'll give you is an answer that will be echoed by so many people from the film fraternity, including critics, I mean, filmmakers, screenwriters, whoever. Is the fact that the CBFC has no business censoring films. It is a certifying body. Certify films and go away. So, I mean, that's how it should be, right? And it's so for me, in an ideal scenario, the CBFC essentially, it certifies film as opposed to censoring it. B, it is largely, I mean, liberal in terms of, it does not adopt a knee jerk or a conservative sort of attitude with respect to things such as offending somebody's sentiments or something that can, impinge or sort of the national security of a country and all of that. And somebody who is pragmatic and all that, and the way we can get those people on the board is that there should be people who are really well versed with the language of cinema. I'm talking about people who are really invested in this project of filmmaking. People who understand that film is a complex, subjective art form. I think so. I mean, perhaps we can have a different kind of examining committee or a revising committee, or perhaps we can change its composition and sort of fill it with people who are more motivated for the love of cinema as opposed to gaining political points or to curry political favors. I think this decoupling of cinema from the state, the gaze of the state, this very restricting sort of directives that the state flings at its filmmakers, if that is decoupled from the censorship process and it is upgraded to it being a certifying process, and you put people who have been in this business for say 20 years, 30 years, 10 years, whatever, they have solid credentials. Again, I'm not in the favor of a system that perpetuates elitism. I'm not saying that.
Yes.
I am not saying that, you need to make 10 great films to be somebody to certify films. No. But there should be more transparency. There should be, and there should be more open, transparent dialogues between the CBFC members and the filmmakers. Right now, the filmmakers are almost scared. They're almost scared of the CBFC people. So this culture of fear, paranoia, this sort of political exploitation that happens in the name of film censorship should be done away with, and be something that that is made more transparent. Would be my wish.
And I assume that within this, you would change who nominates the members of this certification committee from the ruling political party to, say, the film industry or group within that. Right.
Obviously, I think if that is taken care of to a large part, I'm not saying, see, no system can be perfect, but I mean, if your intent is right, then there is some hope. Let me state this on record: the intent of film censorship in this country has never been right, and which takes us to where we are now. And yeah.
Well, that's all I have for you. Thank you so much for speaking with me and with Jurist about film censorship in India. I know it was a very edifying conversation for me and for many around the world about the state of censorship and what that means for the film industry and society as a whole. I really appreciate you speaking with me. If you have any closing thoughts, I welcome you to share them. But otherwise, I wish you a lovely evening.
I'm just very thankful that I had this discussion. I mean, being a writer is anyway a terribly a lonely process, and I've had just these thoughts scattered at some portions of my head, which was very evident in my awfully digressing replies and these non-ending sort of detours. But I'm really happy that that I got the chance to sort of speak about this in some detail, and hopefully speak about it in some complexity and nuance, because of course for the large part, I mean, we know the bad players, the bad apples, so to speak, but as it said at the start of the conversation, that the conversation about the CBFC and film censorship in India, it goes beyond that. It's slightly more nuanced, and in a way it kind of incriminates people like me, quote unquote normal people, who have often sort of impeded the progress of, say, film censorship or film certification process in the country. And it's been my pleasure. Absolutely, I'm so honored. Thank you so much for your time.
It's an honor to have you. Thank you.